This is the Convene podcast. My name is Maggie, Digital Media Editor.
Welcome to another episode of the Convene Talk. Casey, what have you picked for today's discussion?
Thanks, Maggie. I chose a story from Yahoo called Is Zoom Fatigue Still a Thing? Why Video Meetings Are So Draining and What You Can Do About It. Zoom fatigue is something that we talked about extensively during the pandemic when pretty much every office worker was remote. But Zoom fatigue is still very present in our lives, even as some people have returned to office. According to a piece from the New York Times earlier this year, about 20% of the workforce is either hybrid or remote. So video calls are still very much a part of everyday life for a lot of office workers. And of course, we know hybrid and virtual conferences have continued to have a presence in the meetings industry. So this should be relevant to our listeners as well. So the story talked about a new survey published in the journal Frontiers in Psychology, which found that video conferencing backgrounds can influence how fatigued you feel at the end of a call. Researchers carried out a survey with more than 600 participants. All these people worked from home around 3 days a week, and they asked whether they use virtual background and what type of background that was. It could have been a static image, a blurred image, a video, which I guess means, it has some sort of movement in the background, or no virtual background. And the results showed that participants who use video backgrounds experienced the highest levels of fatigue. Users who use blurred backgrounds also had higher fatigue than those who use static images. And they said this is because of how much new information is contained in the background. Image backgrounds initially present new information, they said, but users might gradually shift their attention elsewhere. Blurred backgrounds don't introduce new information, but occasionally users might catch glimpses of something in the background that kind of distracts them and presents new information. And video backgrounds obviously have continuous movement, and so that's new information all the time that you have to process. So I thought this was interesting research. I like that they're still looking into what causes Zoom fatigue, because I think we all feel it here as remote workers, and I just wanted to see your thoughts on it. Michelle?
I have never seen anybody with a video background. I have never, ever been on a call where somebody had some movement in the background, and I'm grateful for that because I feel like that would be super distracting for me. I think we all, just before we got on the call, we were all experimenting with how we were going to take, because we have 2 video calls a week just among ourselves. It's how we were going to put whether we're going to hide our own screen. It is very distracting for me to see myself. So I tend to I don't know if I go through the process of hiding myself officially, but I try not to look at myself when I talk. I think that's really super draining, is to just constantly see yourself and feel like you need to be presenting a certain way is very draining. I feel like video calls continue to be exhausting for people. It's different when it's part of a big call and I need to listen. I think the article talked a little bit about distractions, right? How video calls, you tend to be multi-focused, multi-purpose. And I think that's a bad thing, because I tend to start answering emails or whatever, and you lose focus, and you can tell when somebody is not paying attention. And I don't think that's a good thing. So I've written about this before. Sometimes on these long calls where I need to be paying attention, but I'm not necessarily participating, I will do something like crochet or something, not answer emails, not look at my phone, that requires a different kind of focus, so I can still pay attention to what is being said. But I think that this is still a problem. I also feel like I have been in the office where they have these video calls, yet they're in the office. They could go into a conference room, but I see that in other settings as well, where people will just stay in their office and be on video when they're in the office to have face-to-face meetings. So I think it's just a holdover from the pandemic, and maybe it's just laziness, or maybe it's just easier for people to do that rather than get out of their office and move into another part of the office. Barbara, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I'm thinking about the interview I did early in the pandemic, and I was talking to a psychologist at Yale, and the topic was, what was the shutdown going to do to people's networks? So that was the topic. But when I was setting up the interview, I asked whether she preferred to talk by telephone or by Zoom. And she said, oh, definitely phone. And the reason for phone was, she said, that you really make a much stronger connection by phone than you do by video, because you aren't distracted by all that information that isn't, like, it masquerades as connection, but it's not the same information that you actually get when you're physically with somebody. So it's almost like you're following all these false leads. And so when you're listening on the phone, it makes a very direct personal connection. And so whenever I have the opportunity, when I'm just talking one-on-one, I tend to just do interviews with just by phone. And I find her advice, I think, is really good. I try and hide myself on those really big calls. I always hide myself. But even when I hide myself, I do I worry about, like, what am I doing? And, like, if you really forget yourself and you're really in the meeting, I'm likely to, start, doodling, reaching for something, just, I think it's a really interesting area of research. And I also think that cameras and the ways that people set up video calls are probably going to change a little bit. The last thing I'll say is about backgrounds. I talked to somebody on Zoom, and they had a little video background of a campfire, and it was very novel. I liked it. I think what would be really hard is if everybody had a video of something else, and I'm just wondering about an experiment that people could do. Like, if we had a meeting where we all went, you know what, I'm just going to go with this plain gray background and see how it feels. I appreciate you bringing this to our attention, Casey, because it is like something that everyone's really familiar with. Jen, what are you thinking about?
I thought it was really interesting, your example that you brought up about the interview and whether they prefer phone or Zoom. And because I've started asking, anytime I have an interview, I ask them what they prefer. And I have my own preferences, but I kind of always want to default to the interviewee's preferences. And I feel like, it's interesting. I feel like there's pros and cons to both. I was trying to think, like, which I prefer. And I'm not really sure, like, especially if I'm interviewing someone, if that's my role, I do like video because I do feel like I can get, like, body language is important. And I feel like I can learn a lot from that, especially, depending on the topic. Phone, I think you're right, though. I think there is something about it that makes me focus more on what we're talking about. I get very distracted very, very, very easily. And I do think that phone, it forces you to really just focus on what they're saying. So yeah, pros and cons to both. And I like the idea of trying out different backgrounds. I like having a stationary background, but I do like the fireplace thing that you mentioned. I actually, in the winter, I love having one of those YouTube videos of a crackling fireplace on my TV while I work. But that's just for me. That's just in the background. Casey, what are you thinking? No, I was just also thinking about preferences for interviews, phone versus video. And before I've worked here for like 7.5 years, and pre-pandemic, it was always just phone calls. And I noticed after now everybody says, "Hey, let's hop on a video call." And that I dread that because I like phone calls. I like being able to pay attention to what they're saying. I feel like I can form better follow-up questions that way. I feel like when I'm on video, I'm so focused on like maintaining eye contact with them and trying to seem attentive and alert that I'm not processing what they're saying quite as well as on over the phone. So I definitely try to go for phone calls whenever possible. But one other thing I wanted to bring up from this study, because I'm looking at Michelle's background, which has lovely real greenery in the background. The researchers in this study found that users who use nature-themed backgrounds report lower levels of fatigue compared to others. And they said while other backgrounds like office settings or public spaces can increase users' pressure to self-present as if they were actually in one of those settings. So in a work setting, they said a nature-themed image background might be the ideal choice, which I found really interesting. So with that, Michelle, give it back over to you.
Thanks, Casey. So I do have plants in my office, and that's one of the things I think that is an advantage for me when I talk to someone for the first time is when you see each other in the context of your environment, it kind of breaks the ice. So usually people will say, "Oh, I see you like plants." And then that just becomes a conversation starter. And I'll say, "Yeah, my personal philosophy is why have one plant when you can have 65 because I have plants everywhere in my house. I'm a little bit of a collector." And so it kind of breaks the ice and is a nice conversation starter. I also feel like it's easy for me to zone out when I'm only speaking to someone over the phone. But to your point, Casey, when you're on a video call, you have to look like you're following along and you're engaged. So it forces me to not zone out. So whether you have to pretend to be engaged or you actually are, it's like I think the video reinforces that. So I would love to do like same as what Jen said. Most people say they want to do a video call. So, but it would be nice to kind of balance the two so that not every single interview is a video. And one thing I definitely do is when I have them transcribed is I do not look at the video. I hate seeing myself in a video. And also when we do the podcast and I have to record it and send the recording to Maggie, I refuse to look at the video of all of us. I just immediately hit transcription, just the record thing, and go over and bring it over. So yeah, so I think my problem is being self-conscious on the screen.
I just changed my background to a nature background and I feel so much better already. No, the weird thing I thought about this story was, how does your own background affect you? Because I'm not really looking at myself. It's other people's backgrounds. And they said what a blurry background is good, right? It may not be the best, but it's better than a busy background or a video background, right?
They said it's better than busy, but they said it can also be confusing because, like, say if your pet walks by in the background or something and it's revealed, then it's distracting to people. So
I also, as somebody with really bad vision, I feel really weird when I see blurriness. I feel like something is wrong with my glasses. So yeah.
But I'm always curious. I wonder what's back there when it's blurry. What are they hiding? So I don't know that affects me, but maybe it does. Maybe I am Snoopy and looking at trying to see what's in their background. But I feel like Zoom fatigue. I don't know if it's Zoom fatigue or if it's just meeting fatigue in general. Like if you were at back-to-back meetings in the office and you basically just got done with one meeting and you said, all I have time to do is run to the bathroom or get another cup of coffee and I'm not even moving my stuff out of here, you would be just as fatigued then too. And you also have to be on more, I think, in person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like in-person meeting, if it's a 2-hour meeting where you're sitting at a conference table, I feel just as antsy, if not more so. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you really have to have a poker face. I mean,
yeah.
you can't really roll your eyes or do a deep sigh or something if you are in person.
I thought that whole thing about the recommendation to schedule your meetings far apart from each other was a little bit of a joke, because how many of us schedule all our meetings? They're scheduled for us. The majority are scheduled for us, so we don't have any control over that. So that's sort of like, yeah, that would be nice if that were the case, but
They said in the recommendation that for every 20 minutes, you're looking at the screen to stare off screen for 20 minutes. And I was thinking, I think my fellow video callers would wonder what the heck I'm doing if I'm just staring in the distance for 20 seconds. It's a long time. But Barbara, what were you going to say?
I was just thinking about like the interruptions. I like them. And I don't know if that's just my own personal hunger for novelty, but one of my favorite moments in the early days of the pandemic, I was interviewing this brilliant event professional, and she had a background that was, just like a regular, like it was a screen background. And the research talked about those breaks in the screen where you see what's behind. And so I was talking to this incredibly professional woman in a professional background, and her screen broke. And I saw a Disney poster in the background, and she saw it too. And we laughed. And she said, "I'm in my 3-year-old son's room." And it was like, I loved it because it was like, yeah, I just think that I don't think I get Zoom fatigue. I think I get reality hunger. I mean, we're like trying to interpret all this stuff that's not really part of real life. Like, what is that behind that person? What are they trying to say with that? And when I lived in a small apartment, I had a really tight space, and I had a bookshelf behind me, and it was kind of close. And that kind of definitely made it kind of a more intimate video space. And where I am now here, I can turn this way and look at like 4 redwoods. But like, it's like reality is so different for all of us. And we're not sharing an environment. Like, even if it looks like we are, we're not. And I think I think that's what causes the fatigue, and which is maybe why it's a good idea to stare at for 20 minutes at like reality. But I do hope research is ongoing on this. Maybe we could experiment with nature backgrounds for our next Zoom call.
yeah, I would just ask everybody not to do anything related to a fire, because it makes me feel like a dumpster fire kind of situation. Anytime I see flames in the background, it's not a good thing for me.
Yeah. Maggie.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if you can see because of my background, but I have a dog in my lap. So there you go, another stimulus for you to look at. I just wanted to mention that the one thing I think we did not address from the article were the breaks and movement in between breaks. And I do believe, like Michelle mentioned, many of those meetings that we have in our calendars are scheduled for us. But I believe it's very important to have really a little break in between. And my personal preference is to schedule calls 10 minutes after the hour. And actually, I have programmed my Outlook to do that automatically for me. But the funny thing is that I just love how everyone is just changing their background. I wish that was a video podcast for people to enjoy more greenery and stuff. And I mean, outer spaces. So there you go. Yeah, and I think these 10 minutes are actually very important because they can give people this little time to just move a little, stand up, take a breath, drink some water, basic things, go to the loo or something. Because when they're back to back, you're physically starting to feel exhausted, and it's not helping you staying concentrated or paying attention. And one of the things that you all know I love to do, but I allow myself to do it only in the big all-team calls, is to walk on my walking pad, which is kind of an under-desk treadmill, which is foldable and very small. And I allow myself to do that on big calls because people can just hide me from their view. And I know that makes people dizzy because I'm just moving my upper part of the body and it looks weird to be on screen. So I'm conscious that I cannot do that on all calls. But the other thing I trying to do, not currently at this call, which I regret, by the way, is to have a balance ball or something to just, I'm standing still-ish for the most part, but I'm just trying to balance. So I'm not starting to feel fatigue in my legs for just staying in one place, which I can highly recommend for those that haven't tried it. It's fun and you feel energized because you're still having some movement and not just sitting. Oh, and there you go. Barbara now has a video background, Michelle, for your viewing pleasure.
Another downside of video calls, my cat jumped up on my desk and tore out the plugs, and I went dark for a minute. I don't know what I was saying, but one other thing I wanted to bring up was the eye contact issue, which I find kind of funny because when you're doing an interview, or even right now in our call, are you guys looking at your camera or are you looking at my view at me, right? So if you're looking at me, it's not really eye contact, right? And when you do a video interview, it's not really eye contact unless you're looking up at your camera like I am now, which is kind of funny because, everybody's, somewhere else, I guess, or a little bit somewhere else, because I look at each of you as you speak. So, that sort of is a little bit of a disconnection, but unless you're really thinking about it, when you're doing it. But I'm never going to listen to you and just stare up at the at little screen up there. I guess I wouldn't be a good actor.
Have you seen that new technology that actually makes it mimics your eyes, that they're like looking into the camera. So I can be still looking at you on my screen, but what you are going to see on your screen for me is that my eyes look up at the camera. So you are going to actually get that feeling that I'm looking into the camera and directly into you. It's a very interesting tech. I haven't seen it, penetrate the Zooms and Teams of the world just yet, but it's incredible.
If that wasn't like perfect, it could be really offsetting and odd and distracting.
It sounds scary to me. I feel like what we don't know, what people know, but it hasn't really been articulated and studied, are all the ways we reassure each other in person. Like we might be making eye contact, we might then lean back. If things get intense, we might, I think we signal safety and trust to each other with our bodies in a way that our, disembodied heads and screen eye contact does not do. So I was just working on this story about the rise of something called the offline club, where people they pay to lock up their phones, and then they're just at coffee houses. And one of the things, I didn't really write about this yet because in the article, because it was a shorter article, but they said that the people who signed up for that said they wanted structure in those meetings because there's so much online that they're starting to lose those rhythms, just those everyday rhythms of being together. And I think that's where, I'm just thinking in terms of like wellness is just making sure you don't spend too much time interacting with people just through your screen, because there's just all these ways of communicating that are with your bodies and not just your image on screen.
And I think we all felt it when we recorded the podcast at Convening Leaders. It was in a way much easier to pass on to each other and see who kinds of who has something to say instead of, oh, I have something to say, raising the hand or something. That felt much more natural and it just flowed. While when we're on screen, we really have to kind of warn each other, okay, I have something to say, so that for audio quality, people can actually hear what we're saying, and not, because when we overlap, it becomes impossible. So that's an interesting side. But also, speaking of recording the podcast, I actually had a technical issue with bad internet, and I had to record one episode without the video. And it was just me and the other person and our guest. And it was very hard to know if the person had exhausted the topic. And because I did not also want to overlap or say something on top. And we had these pauses, which were fine. They can be edited easily. But it was I was constantly on my toes. I was like, okay, are we done here? Should we move on? It made it very strange. I don't know if you have the same feeling with phone interviews, though. I'm not sure if it's the same, but for me that felt, I don't know, just different and kind of hard.
I was thinking about this earlier too, about pauses in video. Like if when you're talking on the phone with just one other person or in person, those pauses are a little more mutual. Like you're both pausing and you're pausing. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about, Maggie.
But people don't like dead air, right? Everybody gets uncomfortable when it's silent, and then if that happens for too long, then everybody's trying to say something else, I think.
That's such a good interview trick, though, because I read somewhere or saw somewhere that if you just pause and oftentimes the interviewee will kind of try to fill that space and you get a little bit more than maybe what you wouldn't have gotten.
Yeah, I think they often expand on what they're saying if you just give them another beat and they don't know if you're going to say something or not. They'll say,
yeah.
Oh, and also this, which is really helpful.
You're asking a hard question. That was like an interview trick for hard questions, was they'll rush in to fill the silence because everybody wants to fill silence.
Yeah.
And from time to time, you get a person that you cannot actually shut up. You're like, okay, we're done here. Now, please let me move on with another question.
I'll take that, though, any day over people who, it's like pulling teeth. It's like one-word answers.
I feel like both extremes can be really hard because it's also difficult if you had 10 questions planned and you're getting to the end of your time with them and you've only gotten through 3. It's like, oh no, okay, I'll email you the rest of the questions if you have time. So it can be really challenging in both directions. You have to be prepared for anything.
Yeah, and that's a note for our listeners who organize events. The struggle of having people on stage that just want to go on and on forever, and you have a coffee break coming up and a bunch of other stuff. So I feel that's how they can relate to our struggles of the chatters. I don't know how you call it. Thank you, Casey, for bringing this topic up. And can I mention, I was surprised that Yahoo is still around. I was really impressed. Really? Yahoo still operates?
I was thinking that too when I was looking into what I would say for my intro. I was like, this was from Yahoo? Really? No.
Good. Glad I'm not alone.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're still around. For our listeners, thank you for listening to the end. And as usual, you'll find the article link in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, do give us a 5-star review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts for more industry insights. Visit pcma.org/convene. And until next time.